Hey all, as promised, here is the lecture for our Communism in China introduction. I'm just going to make it big real quick, and while I am, I'm just going to let you guys know a few things. One, you'll want to have your It's Learning Unit 1.2 notes open, and you will want to scroll down to box 2. That's where your questions are going to be posted for this unit. What I'm going to do here is just give you a very brief overview of everything that we're going to be learning about in this unit, and then we'll be spending a day each on these major concepts. So if you feel a little confused or worried after this lecture, don't worry. We're going to be going in depth one thing at a time. This is just to give you kind of some background information. So going back in time, China is a very old country. It goes back thousands and thousands of years, and they, up until very recently, used a monarchy system. They called them dynasties, but it was essentially a monarchy with a king. But by the early 1900s, about 120 years ago, a lot of people were getting really unhappy with the royal family, and they wanted a government without a king. They wanted to be in charge of themselves. So in 1911, a group of people came together and decided to call themselves the Nationalists, and they took over China, and they actually did kick out the king and his family. If you remember, we've talked, you have talked a lot in sixth grade probably about what it means to be a nationalist, and it's people who have pride in their country. So this group of people wanted to be in charge of their own country, control their own country without a king telling them what to do. Unfortunately, the Chinese nationalists were not really able to do the one thing that everybody wanted, which was to end poverty among the peasants. There were a whole lot of people living in poverty and starving in China at this time. And so many people started abandoning the nationalists and saying, we need to look somewhere else to become stronger and richer and just have an easier life. And for a lot of them, they turned to communism. And if you've watched your brain pop already, or if you watch it after this, you'll see that the idea behind communism is to help everyone be equal. There would be no rich versus poor. Everybody would have the same amount of money and resources. And if it works well, the idea is that then there's no suffering. As we see, that unfortunately is not going to end up being the case, but it is what happens at the beginning. So the Communist Party was run by a guy named Mao Zedong, and he started it in 1921, and he promised to improve peasants' living conditions. So a lot of people said, yeah, this sounds great. This is exactly what we want. We want to be better off. We want more money. We want more access to food, and we want to just be treated fairly. You can see that picture of Mao down at the bottom in his usual uniform. That's kind of the Chinese communist outfit right there. All right, so at this point, you'll probably want to pause the video and go back and answer these two questions using your notes. So I'm gonna keep talking, but you should, if you need a minute, go ahead and pause the video right now, take the notes, and then come back to the video. All right, so we've got these communists trying to take control of China with Mao, but there already is a group of people in power, the nationalists, who had gotten rid of the king. So a civil war broke out between the two groups within the country because they both wanted control of China. In 1933, Mao was losing, and so he had to essentially flee from the cities in China and ran 600,000 people, 6,000 miles across China to avoid being captured by the nationalist government. And this was known as the Long March. One benefit of the Long March, though, just as a side note, is that as he was running away, he was going through lots of villages and towns, and he was able to talk to people and share his ideas about communism. So even though he was running away in the war, he was actually becoming more popular as he did that. Okay, so here again, a couple questions. I think number 4 may be the next slide, though, and I apologize about that. So if you can't find the answer for number 4, just hang on a second and come back to this once you've answered number 3. All right, so here's just a few pictures. We're going to talk a lot in this unit about how propaganda works, and propaganda is using art to kind of convey a message. So in this first picture, you can see Mao is the biggest in this picture. He's got all the light around him. He's taller than everybody else, but everybody's marching, and they all look, really happy to be there. Even though some of them look like they might be a little wounded from fighting in battle, they're all happy to be with Mao and proud to be with Mao. And then here again, you can see it's a younger picture of Mao than the other one, but the same outfit with him. All right, so yeah, here's your answer for number 4. But eventually the communist military does win this war. The communist military is called the Red Army, and they eventually are able to take over from the nationalists, declare themselves in charge, and become a country run by Mao. And he actually renames the country of China into the People's Republic of China, reflecting this communist idea that everybody's equal, everybody shares everything. It's everybody's China. And that happened on October 1st, 1949. So when he became the head of the government in China, Mao took over completely. He had almost complete control over China. He was super popular with the Chinese people because he almost immediately started doing some of the things that he had promised to do. He actually took land and money from wealthy citizens and gave it to the peasants, and immediately started trying to improve the lives of the poor people in China. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a second to hit pause here, and then I'm going to move on. All right, so one of the first things that Mao did was come up with this idea for something called the Great Leap Forward. And his idea was to increase China's success and power. China was a little bit lower on the economic scale at this point because of their civil war, and he wanted to make China more successful. So in areas with lots of arable or farmable land, he decided that everyone should leave their jobs and become farmers. And in areas where there were lots of factories where people could make things like steel, machinery, things like that, everyone should leave their jobs and work in the factories. And his idea was that this would speed China's economic development. It would help them leap forward into a new economic age, which is why it was called the Great Leap Forward. Okay, so for this first question, it's always confused people a little bit. So when Mao was appointed the new leader of China, you're going to want to look at these 2 bullet points here. These are where you're going to find your answers for that. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to hit pause, answer these questions. Okay, so the Great Leap Forward did not work. You're going to do some reading about this later on this week, but it was a complete disaster. One of the things that happened was that non-farmers were forced to become farmers and did not know how. So if you think about your own families, whoever you live with and your extended families, maybe some of them are farmers and they would know what to do, but the majority of your family members probably are not. And if you were to just, plop them down on a farm and say, go for it, none of us would know what to do. And so that causes problems, that really end up having a huge impact. And then additionally, it was just a bad couple of years with weather. And so lots of droughts and floods across China damaged the food supply and made things even worse. And as a result, a huge number of people, there's somewhere between 20 million and 50 million people that are estimated to have starved to death during a famine during the Great Leap Forward. Here's some pictures of farms. So here's people that are all farming together. Lots of these people in these pictures, used to be doctors or mechanics or owned restaurants, things like that. And now they are all farming. Okay, so you'll take a minute here and answer these questions. And then that is actually the end of the notes for Monday, which is today right now. I'm filming right now. So you can stop here and come back tomorrow if you'd like. And then you would just fast forward the video until this point, which it looks like we're on slide 17. And And you might want to make note of the time. It doesn't show me the time. But if you go ahead and stop it, you'll want to see how much longer you have in the video so that you know where to start it up tomorrow. I'm going to keep going though. All right, so the failures of the Great Leap Forward led to the next thing that we're going to be learning about, called the Cultural Revolution. And this came about because Mao was very embarrassed that the Great Leap Forward was such a failure, but dictators don't tend to like acknowledging their failures. And so Mao became worried that if people started talking about the Great Leap Forward and how much it did not work, he would start losing power in China. And so what he did was he created this idea of the Cultural Revolution, and it happened in 1966. And the concept was to stop all opposition to the Chinese Communist Party. And what he did was he actually used students. He used people your age, a little bit younger than you, a little bit older than you. It was essentially middle schoolers through college students. And he urged them to quit school and to basically just wander the streets every day looking for anybody who might not be 100% in support of Mao Zedong and go after them. So these students organized themselves into a group known as the Red Guard, and they would literally just go through the streets of China trying to find people that they didn't believe were supportive enough of Mao Zedong, and they would attack, imprison, and sometimes even not themselves, but they would get people arrested and then executed if they thought that they did not agree with Mao. Obviously, this is going to cause chaos, and so China was it was very chaotic in China for about 10 years there because no one knew who they could trust, no one knew who they could talk to, and no one felt like they could talk about the government. They couldn't have their own opinions about the government. And in addition, because Mao Zedong had encouraged people from the ages of basically 10 to 25 to stop what they were doing and just, be a Red Guard, lots of schools closed, lots of factories closed, and people ended up losing their jobs and education. So then you have all these kids, that can't read, factories don't have enough people making things, and it just became a huge disaster. Okay, so I'll give you guys a minute to pause here and answer these. Okay, so this question you can skip because we actually are going to have a separate little mini unit where we talk about propaganda. So you can go ahead and skip these two questions. You can delete it if you want, or just leave them blank. That is okay. All right, so 10 years after the Cultural Revolution begins, Mao Zedong passes away, and when he dies, that's the end of the Cultural Revolution. China's new leader, a man named Deng Xiaoping, realized that the Cultural Revolution was not working, and so he decided to make lots of changes to Mao's rules. He started to allow farmers to control their own farms again. He let people go back into their businesses that they wanted to own. Things just sort of started steadying and becoming normal again. Unfortunately, though, China stayed very communist, and this meant that they were not given basic human rights that we just take for granted here in the US, like freedom of speech or the right to a fair trial. It was not allowed for you to speak out against your government, which is going to be important in a moment. Okay, so here you can see these two questions. You can go ahead and pause to answer these questions. All right, so the last thing that we're going to talk about today is something called Tiananmen Square. So time passes, Deng Xiaoping becomes the leader in 1976, and we've got, more than 10 years pass. And all of a sudden, in the late 1980s, communist governments started to fall around the world. You guys learned about the Soviet Union last year. It started to lose power. And this was being noticed by students around the world, or in China. China was starting to notice, hey, all these people around the world are getting rid of communism, and they are starting to be democratic, which means that they have more say in their government. And so, in particular, Chinese college students became very interested in democracy. And eventually they decided to protest in Tiananmen Square, which is in the capital of Beijing, which is the capital of China. They filled the square for 7 weeks. They stayed there for 7 weeks, and they were peacefully speaking out against communism and calling for democracy in China. They wanted China to become a democratic country. But the soldiers were not allowed to let them stay because, again, communist country, they don't like you protesting against their leadership. And so the Chinese government decided to break up the protests. But even though the protesters were being peaceful, the Chinese government came in with soldiers and tanks to force everybody to leave. And ultimately, this ended up killing hundreds of people. And it was on the news because there were news channels there filming the protests, filming the students protesting. And so countries around the world saw the government use violence against its own people and started to urge China to fix what it was doing to people, to improve the human rights of its citizens. So just to give you an example of what these protests look like, this is Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1988. This is a year before the protest. So just take note, particularly notice this building here, because in the next picture I show you, it's going to be the exact same shot, but you're going to have a hard time even seeing the building. So I just want you to notice it here. You can see lots of people. It's obviously a busy place. People have set up tents, probably to sell things. It's a tourist location. You can see a large picture right here. That is Mao Zedong. It's actually still up today in 2021. So then here is during the protest. So you can see how crowded this was. And you'll notice that most people are wearing white. They were trying to wear a color that was not communist. Now, obviously, there are some people wearing red, but most people are encouraged to have worn white because it's almost like the opposite of red. But here is that building again. Here's that statue or that poster of Mao, but in front of it now is a statue of Lady Liberty showing an American symbol of democracy. You can see some tents where people would like take turns sleeping because they really did just camp out here for 7 weeks. But the military does send in its tanks. You can see this very long line of tanks. This is a very famous picture because there's a guy standing right in the front, and he was trying to block the tanks. Every time the tank would try to move around him, he would just walk and stay in front of the tanks. And there were news helicopters everywhere watching this. And ultimately what he did was save a lot of people's lives because they had the chance to escape the square before the soldiers actually came in. Eventually the tank did just start rolling right at him, and he had to jump out of the way and kind of dispersed into the crowd. So no one even knows who this guy is, but it's a very famous picture. All right, so here are your next 2 questions, and we're getting pretty close. Oh, we're actually done. Yay. So if you guys have any questions for me, now would be a good time to shoot me an email and let me know if you need help with anything, if you didn't understand some of the answers to the questions. But remember, if some of this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you yet, that's okay. This is just the background information, and we will be going over each of these events in more detail this week and next. Okay, bye.